Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to our fifth webinar in the Digital Telecare webinar series. Today we are joined by Richard Parkinson from Farrpoint and Russell Scott from NHS24, who will be covering technical standards for digital telecare in Scotland. Just a couple of logistics. We will be recording today's webinar, so it can be accessed and shared at a later date. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, we will be having a Q&A session afterwards. You may notice this is a shorter webinar than usual, but we will continue the Q&A until we've answered as many questions as we can today. So without further ado, I will pass over to Richard, who will kick us off.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Siobhan was just saying, we're going to give an overview today about technical standards for digital telecare. We've got two items really on the agenda. I'll be covering off the first one, which is looking at the current technical standards for digital telecare and some recommendations around those. And then I'll hand over to Russell, who will provide an overview of what's going to be happening next with digital telecare standards, what's coming down the line, etc. And as Siobhan said, we'll take questions and answers at the end. So on to just a quick summary of what digital telecare standards are around at the moment. We have a number of standards that are available for both dispersed alarms and group schemes. And this slide is summarizing which ones are available. For dispersed alarms, there's really three main ones. There's SCAIP, which is the Swedish standard that's been around for a while now, since Sweden started its migration to digital a number of years ago. There is TS 50134-9, snappily named standard. Hopefully you now have some slides in front of you. Apologies for that. You have TS 50134-9, which is the Cenelec standard. So we'll just call it Cenelec just for less of a mouthful moving forward. And there's a number of manufacturers' own protocols, proprietary protocols that they use as well for dispersed alarms. For group schemes, there's Now IP, which is a standard that was developed by a number of telecare equipment manufacturers. And then there's also specific manufacturers' proprietary protocols as well. So just a summary of which ones we would recommend. I think the first thing to say is that we recommend that wherever possible, you avoid using the manufacturer's proprietary protocols. There's a few reasons for doing that, but the main one is to avoid supplier lock-in. If you avoid the proprietary protocols, then you've got more of an ability to mix and match equipment from a number of different equipment suppliers. And it also means that you've got flexibility to share services with other telecare providers, for example, potentially having reciprocal disaster recovery arrangements and the ability to hand your alarms over to another telecare center if you have a problem with your own facility. And also to allow you to take advantage of any emerging features or new solutions that come out from manufacturers. We believe that that's more likely to be supported by the open protocols than the proprietary ones. So these are things like people offering support for telecare in terms of integration with home automation devices, Amazon Alexa, Google Home, and also with wearable devices. One caveat on that recommendation is that you do need to check with your supplier if there's any loss of functionality with you using an open standard rather than the proprietary standard, because there are some features, potentially some features that are advertised for equipment that may only be available if you're using proprietary protocols. So you need to ask the question of your suppliers, to check if there's anything that functionality that's lost if you do opt for one of the other standards. Other than the manufacturer's proprietary protocols, any of the other protocols can be used, but there are a couple of areas to consider, and we've got a slide on each of these, those being security and availability of equipment. So just looking at security first, and I think the main thing to note is that there are known security issues with the SCAIP standard. So this is the Swedish standard, in that it doesn't offer any encryption of the signaling traffic or the voice traffic. The signaling traffic at the moment is not highly sensitive in that it's mostly anonymized in terms of it's transmitting device IDs rather than user names and things like that. But voice traffic will in time start to be carried digitally as well, and obviously that's a lot more sensitive and something that you would want to be encrypted. This is especially an issue for fixed broadband connections rather than connections using the GSM network, although the Cenelec standard does help to address these issues. I've tried to explain this a little bit more in the diagram on the right that you can see. What we're showing, if you start at the top there, is a device in a home that is using the SCAIP standard. And as you see from the padlock, that's really trying to show where the security is being introduced. SCAIP isn't a problem when you're using it in a mobile setting, because although SCAIP itself doesn't encrypt the traffic, a layer of security is added by the GSM network provider. So they send the traffic over what is called a private APN. So it keeps it separate from other users' traffic on the network. And it also will encrypt the traffic between the GSM network all the way back to the alarm receiving center. So that level of security is offered by the GSM service provider rather than by the protocol itself. The second deployment down in the middle there is really just trying to show what happens when you've got a direct connection to the internet. So this would be you using, a DSL or a fiber connection direct to the internet rather than connecting to a mobile network. You can't use SCAIP direct in that setting because there's nothing there to provide the security. So what you have to do is add another device in the home that secures that connection, and that's shown in the diagram there as some form of VPN device, virtual private network, that basically encrypts the connection between the home and the alarm receiving center. So that could either be a dedicated VPN box or more likely some kind of firewall. That can be done technically. It's not too much of an issue to do that, but operationally that might cause some problems in terms of the fact that that VPN device would switch off in the event of a power cut in the home, and also there's a cost associated with providing that device in obviously a large number of users' homes. So that's why generally we recommend against using SCAIP in a fixed broadband setting. The final diagram at the bottom there shows the same fixed broadband connection, but the Cenelec standard being used in the device rather than SCAIP. And as you can see there's no need for any form of VPN device or firewall in the home because that Cenelec standard is encrypted, so that's able to provide a secure link directly back via the internet to the alarm receiving center. So the recommendation is to use the Cenelec standard definitely for broadband connections and as the preferred route, even when you're connected to a GSM network as well, given the additional layer of security that offers. For the grouped protocols, we're not aware of any issues with the Now IP protocol. The security for that is provided by the fact that the connection to the group scheme is generally encrypted anyway. And we are going to be completing penetration testing with the Wave 1 and Wave 2 partnerships. So if there are any issues or problems or best practice that comes out of that that process is going to uncover that, and that's something that we'll be able to share with everybody on a later webinar. As I said, the other issue to look at when you're looking at which standard to use is availability, and this is availability of the equipment itself. Generally, we found that a range of digital standards, including the Cenelec standard, are supported on digital alarm receiving center systems, but there's a lot less support offered on the digital alarm end of the connection, and it really varies from supplier to supplier in terms of the support that they offer. Generally, what you'll find is that the SCAIP standard is supported by a range of suppliers, and that really reflects the fact that that standard's been around for a while. It's been in use in Sweden at scale, and therefore there's been a market for that digital device and that protocol for a long time, a relatively long time, and so that there is generally quite good availability for that. The Cenelec standard was ratified and approved back in the summer, but as far as we're aware, there's currently no alarm boxes out there that are supporting that, or certainly there's none that we've come across yet. So at the moment, you would struggle to buy a Cenelec standard alarm to put into your deployment. Grouped housing digital protocols, they do exist, but the amount of equipment that you can buy that supports that, again, is currently quite limited. So as you can see there is currently quite an issue with trying to get hold of devices that support the full range of digital protocols, but I guess the good news is that we are expecting that situation to improve quite rapidly over the coming months. As say, Cenelec has been ratified for a number of months now, and demand for digital equipment will only start to rise as more and more people start the shift across to digital. So we're expecting availability of devices that support these newer protocols to become a lot more available. And what we're expecting as well is that there are some of the devices that are out there using the SCAIP protocol at the moment that are likely to be able to be upgraded via software to support the Cenelec standard, but probably not all the devices out there, and some the equipment may need to be replaced. So that is something that you may want to take up with your equipment manufacturer. So last slide for me is really just a summary of our recommendations around the current digital protocols. Firstly, avoid proprietary protocols wherever possible. For dispersed alarms, we recommend using the Cenelec standard when it becomes available, and SCAIP can be used in the meantime. But as we outlined before, you do need to be aware that there are some issues and considerations around using SCAIP if you are connecting users using fixed broadband connections. For group schemes, we recommend Now IP, and just highlighting that this is an area of the market that is evolving relatively quickly. So there is a need to monitor what's happening in the marketplace and what equipment becomes available, but we're doing that within the national program as well, and we'll certainly be communicating out to partnerships as and when we see any significant movements, and if that involves any changes to our recommendations. So that's a summary of where we are with the digital protocols that are available at the moment, and on that I'll hand across to Russell, who can provide an overview of what's coming on the horizon.
Richard, thank you very much. So as Richard mentioned there, I'm just going to cover briefly in terms of the kind of development side of things in terms of technical standards. So I thought it'd be useful just to go through that at a very high level. As things currently stand, UK is part of the European community as such. So this is as things were until Brexit obviously kicks in, and obviously I'm not taking any questions around the political aspects. So that's for another time in particular. So without going into too much detail, developing technical standards, Cenelec is obviously a recognised European regional standards organisation. That with its sister organisation, CEN, obviously the European Committee for Standardisation as well, and they work in collaboration with ETSI, which is the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. And obviously between them, they compose and develop European standards organisations. Within that kind of structure, they have what they call technical committees. And each of these technical committees have a decision-making body that's established, and they then obviously scope and prepare these Cenelec publications. The members of these committees are part of the Cenelec National Committee, and they appoint delegates to participate in these technical committee groups. So within Europe, under that structure, there's Technical Committee number 79, and they're actually focused on preparing these technical standards and requirements for intruder, access control, fire alarms, CCTV, and more importantly, social alarm systems. Under that technical group, there's 15 working groups that work on these requirements and standards, and work group 4 in particular focus on the social alarms. And I think there's about 10 members across the European Union that support that. So within obviously the UK, we have the British Standards Institution, and that's recognised as the UK's national standards body by the UK government. And obviously part of that is they're a member of the international standards, ISO, the IEC as well, and they work very much in a mirrored structure to the Cenelec, CEN and ESTI within European Communion. And again, they have a very similar approach in terms of supporting these technical standards in terms of developing them and getting them ratified. And they have, again, a technical group set up that mirrors that. So within that structure under the BSI, there is, again, a technical committee group responsible for social alarms. And they have delegates to participate at a European level. They produce national comments and responses to these drafts or inquiries, and they also recommend on how UK should vote. Now, BSI have been around for about 100 years or so, and obviously they have huge experience in shaping standards, leading and facilitating the process, and to actually reach a consensus. And they actually are obliged to adopt all European standards that have been developed, approved and positively voted by the likes of CEN and Cenelec and ESTI as well. But obviously in part of that would have to withdraw any existing British standards that may conflict with them. Just going at a very high level in terms of those technical standards and how that's actually processed. So what would happen is that at an outset there would be a drafting of an allocated Cenelec technical body, and they would obviously look to draft a standard at the European or international level. From there, then there's an inquiry part where suitable drafts are actually submitted to the National Committee in BSI, and that can last up to about 5 months, depending on the complexity and what's involved in these types of standards. That then the National Committee then would liaise with their stakeholders, and that includes industry, federations, consumer associations, certificate bodies, etc. And this is where we have a place at the table within the actual programme here. So we do have a voice there to actually comment, review, and take part in actually developing these. So that can take time in going back and forth and looking at clarifying any of these technical standards or requirements. Then there's a voting part, and that usually takes about 2 months at this stage for members to have a kind of vote. And within the European Community, there's obviously larger countries like France and Germany, Italy, and they have obviously a kind of more of a weighted vote towards that. And UK as well, we have kind of 29 votes each, while some of the smaller countries only have 3 weighted votes. So that voting process takes place, and then there's an approval part there where adoption by weighted votes goes ahead. And then we get to that ratification and publication of the standards. And after that, then each national committee would adopt those European standards that are identical, and as I say, they would have to withdraw any that are conflicting. All in all, that can take up to 4 years, depending on the kind of complexity and what's involved in these standards. So, you know, let's just put it out there that they do take some time, and it's not a quick win, unfortunately. So there's a lot of clarification and obviously process to go through there. So in terms of the social alarm standards, I thought this was just a bit of an illustration how that's actually broken down. So we have the kind of, as you would say, like a main trunk there, and we've got kind of different parts. So we have part 1, which is the system requirements of BS-EN 50134, and that really covers the spec minimum requirements for a social alarm system. Then we have a part 2, which covers the trigger devices. This obviously then automatically activates trigger devices in transmitting our triggering signals within the social alarm journey. We have part 3, which is a standard looking at the local unit and controller. We have part 4, which is all about the warning devices in the social alarm. Then we have part 5, which covers the minimum requirements for interconnections and communications, and that covers also radio frequency, audio, transmission time, fault reporting, etc. We have part 6, which is all about the power supplies. We have part 7, which is a application guidelines. Again, that standard provides recommendations to service providers about the efficient and effective management of policy and procedures about installing, testing, operating and maintaining social alarms. Part 7, we've covered just there. Part 8 is the free one, so we don't have anything there at the moment. And then latterly, part 9 was, as mentioned, this is the IP communication protocol, which again, we're referring to Cenelec for easiness. So that was just recently ratified and approved earlier on in the year. I think it'd be also useful just to cover some other relevant standards for folks out there. So we have the existing BS 8521. Again, that's the spec for the dual tone multi-frequency signaling protocol for social alarm. So that's still obviously used out there currently. There's also the general requirements for alarm transmission systems as well. Again, another standard recognised out there in industry. And lastly, there was one last year as well about the monitoring and alarm receiving centres, BSEN 50518 parts 1, 2, 3. So again, that tells you about the requirements of the construction, the technical requirements, procedures and requirements of operating. So there's some other relevant technical standards that might be useful just to be mindful of when we're looking to actually install and procure digital telecare services. As I said, being part of the technical committee, we're getting aware of what's actually coming over that hill as such in terms of the next year or so. So again, at a very high level, Richard mentioned the Now IP, so it was just to let you know that that's now been released by TSA to BSI with some recommendations, and that's really to add further encryption. They're looking at to actually maintain that IP protocol. So that activity is underway, so hopefully that's going to be progressed throughout the year. There's also been a recent request to look at the kind of service chain model as well, which is looking at a technical standard around about the framework for a customer and operational requirements about that service chain in supporting digital telecare as well. And that first phase concentrates on all those processes to support an IP-based and mobile technologies. They're going to refresh the interconnections and communication. That was part 5 of the technical standard. So there's a proposal there to refresh that and upgrade that. And there's also going to be looking at a new standard around the installation of social alarms in a grouped housing as well, part 1. So that proposal's just been drafted. But again, these take time. But it's useful being excited on these, and we have a voice at, as I say, that table to try and discuss and review any of those technical standards that are coming down the line. So that was really just a bit of background in terms of how standards are developed, designed, and obviously progress through that kind of journey as such. So I thought it'd be useful just to highlight that we are well positioned in actually supporting some of that work going forward in the digital telecare. And now I'm going to pass you back over to Siobhan for any questions.
Thanks very much to Richard and Russell there. So we're moving on to the Q&A session just now. We'll give you a few minutes to use the chat box or the question area to type any questions that you may have. There's a couple of things just to mention at the moment. We now have a new section on the Digital Office website to cover digital telecare at the moment. So please feel free to check that out. That's at digitaloffice.scot. We also have a new email address for Digital Telecare also, which is digitaltelecare@digitaloffice.scot. So any questions you may have out with this webinar, please feel free to email us directly. All information on future webinars will be shared with all our attendees today, and that will probably be towards the end of January into February of 2019. Again, today's been recorded, so we will upload this to our YouTube channel afterwards, and you can access this at a later date, and we would encourage you to share this with your colleagues as well, just making sure that everybody's got as much information as they possibly can. So we have one question at the moment, and for you, Richard, could Richard please comment on the loss of the O2 network last week? This could happen to any of the GSM providers.
A comment would be that it was absolutely shocking, but I'm guessing the question is looking at it from a Telecare perspective. So I think the bottom line is that yes, this would have affected Telecare, especially given the recommendation that we have as the primary connectivity for digital Telecare is to use the mobile networks. The mobile devices will come with a roaming SIM, which means that obviously if one network was down, then they would roam to another network in order to get the next best signal. I think there's a couple of things just to bear in mind and not get overly complacent with that. I mean, firstly, that assumes that you have a second network available, and for many parts of Scotland, certainly currently that's not the case. The other thing is that the O2 network, in a lot of cases, didn't go down completely. It was still available for making phone calls, although not all the time. But there was a signal there. The issue was that it didn't work for data. So roaming SIMs, if they're programmed to look for the strongest signal, may still have locked onto O2. So I think there's a question there about what that means in terms of the questions that need to be asked about the programming of the roaming SIMs, whether they actually just look for the strongest signal or whether they are able to check that data is being passed, and I think that's something that we certainly need to look at, because this has brought this issue forward and highlighted that it is an issue that needs to be looked at. Having said that, also remember that analog telephone lines also aren't 100% reliable. As we've seen, there's been some fairly high-profile outages in Scotland in the last month or so, with people unable to dial 999 and things like that, with their landlines going down. So bottom line is that we need to be able to provide as many kind of safety nets and second ways of communicating as possible with any form of telecare.
Thanks, Richard. Another one here, wondering if Alexa complies with the Cenelec standard.
So I can take that one. Currently, no, it doesn't comply, but that doesn't mean to say it can comply. And I think, I don't want to obviously speak on behalf of the innovation programme, but that might be something we should be looking at in terms of the kind of Internet of Things, in terms of some of the innovation going forward. So that's something we should be considering and speaking to the likes of Amazon, and obviously the likes of them as well as Google in particular. So answer's currently no, but it could change in the future.
Another one possibly for you, Russell, as well. Now IP is the same idea as SCAIP and Cenelec. What is meant by grouped scheme protocol?
So just in terms of the group scheme, then, this is where we're talking about there's a number of users within that kind of complex that have got telecare services, but it goes through one kind of controlling system. So instead of having the individual services, that it's kind of in terms of a grouped housing setting. So we do have a current Now IP protocol to manage that. And as I said, there is a new proposal to look at actually enhancing that with some additional encryption in light of the digital telecare going forward. So that should be hopefully something we're on the right process and getting sorted, if that's okay.
I think another one again for you.
What are you laughing for?
Are you able to develop and share a matrix of where standards are in terms of their development? For example, approved in the approval process, initiated but not yet in the approval process, etc.
Sorry, we're just changing headsets. Short answer, Siobhan, is yes. I mean, we can get that provided out in terms of a bit of a table there, if that's useful. So we do have that information, so we'll get that through maybe the PMO and get that sent out separately to folks.
Maybe give you a bit of a break now then. Richard, will there be reference to encourage supplier interoperability in the standards?
As I said in my part of the presentation, we're encouraging users to use the open protocols rather than anything proprietary. So that should make sure that there's supplier interoperability. Just the fact that the demand from telecare providers will be for these open standards should drive suppliers to support those.
Great, thanks. With consideration for Scottish national deployment of IoT and LoRa-based gateways, is there any potential links to digital telecare for any Internet of Things business case developments? Do you want to pick this up, Richard?
I think that would come under the stream of the program that we have around innovation. So we're very much focused at the moment in looking at using existing technologies in order to move telecare across to digital. LoRa and other emerging technologies, even though LoRa is now relatively well established and is being rolled out in Scotland, would fall under the innovation work stream that we have, where we have both DHI and Census who are looking at IoT, involved in looking at how those technologies can apply to telecare.
And I think the next question relates to one of the questions earlier on, Russell. Do we know if consumer wearable product manufacturers, for example, Apple and Samsung, etc., are considering any of these open standards and how these might interface with systems?
Again, kind of referring to the previous answer about the Alexa. So currently no, but this is something that we're looking at as part of the innovation program. Again, we're very aware that the kind of consumer tech is something we need to actually tap into and integrate. So that's something, as Richard just mentioned there, as part of the innovation with DHI, is something we're looking at, and we've got some dedicated projects to look at that hopefully in the next year or so.
Thanks very much for that. We have another last question here. May have been covered slightly earlier on with the O2 network failure earlier last week. What safeguards or backup approaches are suggested in the standards? Richard, can you pick this one up?
I think this is talking about, again, these issues that were around the O2 network failure and what safeguards there are around those. I think the safeguards are around how those roaming SIMs work and whether they would be able to cope with a failure like that. So it's not a complete switch off of the O2 network, and it's more kind of disruptive than that in that the network was still there. It just wasn't working for data for a lot of the time. So as I say, I think we need to have those discussions with the roaming SIM providers that are being used by the telecare equipment manufacturers, of which there's relatively few. It's down in the low single digits of suppliers that they're using. So it should be relatively easy to have those discussions and just find out what safeguards that they have to help cope with that kind of failure.
That's great, thank you very much. I think that's the last of our questions at the moment. I appreciate this has been pretty short, this webinar, and there may be some more complicated questions that you may want to ask Richard or Russell. So I would encourage you to email digitaltelecare@digitaloffice.scot, and one of the guys will get back to you for any questions that you may need answered. So I think we will wrap up now. We've ran a wee bit over time this afternoon, but I'm sure you'll all agree that that was very informative. The next webinars, as I mentioned earlier on, will be promoted to all our attendees here today, and they will be on our website at digitaloffice.scot as well. We do have a rough draft format of what the future webinars will look like. However, we are encouraging everyone to get in touch with ideas or suggestions of what you would like to see in the future. So again, if you do have anything, please do email digitaltelecare@digitaloffice.scot. So I'd like to finish off by thanking Russell and Richard for today. And also on behalf of the Digital Office, NHS24, Technology Enabled Care and Scottish Centre for Telehealth and Telecare. Thank you very much for today, and we hope to see you on future webinars. Done.